One of the decisions that those who are outfitting Montessori classrooms must make on a regular basis is whether or not to purchase a material or to make it themselves, or something in between. Things like the printables that are so widely available on the internet, both for free and for typically a low costs, are sort of in between, because you do have to print them out, laminate them if you're going to do that, and cut them and put them into containers in the classroom. But it certainly is not all that's involved with making materials from scratch, from finding out the information, putting the illustrations together, and all of those steps. So I'm going to talk a little bit in this segment about how to make some of those decisions. How do you decide whether or not to make a material, whether or not to buy it, or whether or not to get files and then make it up yourself? Now, I am going to refer back to a recommendation that I've made many times before, particularly for those of you who are homeschoolers, or for those of you who are at least open to the idea of maybe involving more children in your Montessori program than just the children in your own family. By this, I mean that you might want to look into doing a small program in your home. There's two approaches to this that I'd like you to think about. One of them is a homeschool co-op. The reason is that a lot of the materials that are so important in the Montessori classroom are difficult to obtain in terms of a budget. You do have a lot to purchase for any of the different age levels, and if you are planning to homeschool your children from birth all the way up through age 12 or beyond, you have a lot of materials that you're going to be acquiring. If you're working in a co-op basis, this is certainly much more manageable. The other option that I'm going to mention is that of having an in-home program, either an in-home preschool program or an in-home childcare program featuring your Montessori materials. Now, this is a lot more work in other ways rather than buying and purchasing materials, but it does, of course, have two important advantages. One, it makes Montessori available to more children, so it is a gift to your community and it brings in income. Many people don't realize that in most communities, having up to about 6 children in their home for a program is something that they can do. Usually requires licensure, usually requires an in-home business license and some kind of license from the child care regulating people in your community. Not always, depends on how many hours typically that you have the children in your home. So this is something that I just want you to think about as you're making some of these decisions. Now, I'm going to start off with the most important reason not to make some of the material yourself. And I've talked about the pink tower and the very precise nature of this material in other segments, but I want to point a couple of things out to you. This material is exactly 1 centimeter in unit of difference. We've talked about this before, so if this is a redo, forgive me, but I do think it's an important point. If I place this little unit of difference cube and this next cube together, you can see that there is exactly that much difference. Now you can see it and you can think about it because you know what a centimeter is and all that, but it's different for a child. This is not about thinking about centimeters for the child. It's not about thinking in the way that you deal with measurements at all. This is about taking advantage of the absorbent mind period so that when a child uses this material, when their hand communicates to their brain this size through the movements of the fingers, through feeling the weight of the individual cubes, some very, very specific information goes in. And it's some information that can serve the child, I believe, in ways that we don't even understand later on as they move into their higher mathematical skills. If you want that kind of information, that kind of benefit to your 2.5, 3-year-old child, you must have a material that's made with that degree of precision. If it's not going to serve. And so I do want you to remember that for some of the materials. Some of the ones specifically that I feel fall into this category are all of what I call the dimensional sensorial materials. That's the pink cubes, the brown prisms, the red rods, the cylinder blocks and the knobless cylinders, as well as all of the geometric sensorial materials and even the cultural sensorial materials. What I mean by that are things like the puzzle maps and the botany cabinet, even some things such as models of the earth. If these materials are not precise and accurate, then incorrect information goes into the child's mind. That's one of the reasons to make sure that you're using very accurate materials. If that child is picking up the country of Brazil in the puzzle piece for the map of South America and tracing around the edges of that country and placing it back into its home continent, that information is going in a very particular way. If you're using just paper maps, if you're using things that are not made so precisely, you're not going to gain those benefits. So I do encourage you to make sure that that be one of your prime considerations. If you want to get the most important aspects of Montessori education, these things must be considered. Now, another thing that we have talked about is the cost that's involved with making materials that you print out on your color printer. This is an important enough point, I think, for people to consider that I'm going to make it again here, which is when you are figuring your cost to make materials yourself, make sure you are factoring in three things. First is your time. This is one of the reasons that I mentioned that you may want to look into whether there is a way that your own home program, if that's what you're doing, could benefit others and bring in some money that would help you to pay for the program that you're doing for your own children. That is money you can make by having other children involved, and potentially would mean that if you have money earning abilities like that, that needs to be figured into your cost of making materials. If you don't enjoy it particularly, and you could be making more money doing other things, either in a home setting with your Montessori or involved with other money-making activities that you have, that should be considered. The second thing is the cost, all of the cost of the raw materials to make the materials yourself. And the point that I was getting ready to make is that of the toner. The color toner, the quality paper that's needed to produce some of the color print materials from free online PDFs does cause that cost to go much up above free. Now, obviously, you can do it a little bit at a time. The cost to buy the files is low, so then you can kind of make them up as you can afford the other materials, but it should be considered if you actually are on a tight budget. And the last piece that I want you to consider is making that materials making part of what you're doing a key part of how you serve the children. So rather than making all the things that can already be purchased easily, consider having the materials that you make be ones that are tailored to the interest of the children. If you find a child is very, very interested in marsupials, that would be the kind of place that I would like you to put your materials making energies and your materials making time into making materials about the marsupials, particularly if you have a child who's a beginning reader or isn't reading at all. Taking that time to then make some of those cards available, to make booklets available about those attributes of that particular kind of mammal, that would be the best use of your time from my perspective. And finally, you may find as you research the materials that have already been made that there are some things you didn't think about. And so even if you're going to make the materials on your own, I encourage you to be very, very well aware of the materials that are out there. I encourage you to go to Montessori conventions if you can and spend some time on the exhibitor's floor. Spend some time with the catalogs that you can get from these suppliers and on their websites. This will help you to realize important things. One of the suppliers that I have learned a lot from is Priority Montessori, and I realized from their research of the different planets in our solar system the fact that so many of them have rings. Most of us think of Saturn as the planet with the rings, and it's very beneficial when you are looking to provide this information to children in this period of the absorbent mind to be as precise as you can be. Make sure that the information that's going in is what you want to go in as you make these decisions, which things to make and which things to buy.
every Montessori educator who is a lead in a classroom, who is responsible for an environment, a Montessori environment, needs to make decisions about making and buying materials, as well as storing them and when to present them and rotating them and all those other things. And in this segment, I'm going to talk a little bit about making some decisions about making and buying materials and what kinds of things to consider while you're doing that. For most people, there's three primary approaches to a lot of the paper materials in the classroom. One, if you're in a classroom where you have a large budget, may be simply to purchase the materials already made, already printed, maybe even already laminated and cut, kind of depending on what you're purchasing and from whom. If that is your option, I would encourage you to take advantage of that as much as you can, because especially if you're at the beginning of your time in the classroom, there's always going to be a lot to do. If your budget will not allow that, you're probably going to be doing some combination of printing out materials from color files that are available either for free on the internet with a little bit of work and sorting through, or at, of course, a much lower price than a pre-printed material. And the third option is something that has become a little less common, especially with people who don't go through a formal Montessori training program of a pretty decent amount of time, and that is coloring materials that have been that the masters have been provided for you. That's what you see here. This is a booklet, the control portion of a booklet on volcanoes that is that I made many years ago from the training that I was in, and you can see that there is an illustration of the individual parts of the volcano, and then a label of what the portion is, and then the description below. And of course on the front is the illustration of the entire volcano. Now, one of the things that I have heard again and again from teachers, from classroom educators who do go through a Montessori training program and make at least some of their materials in this way, hand color the materials, particularly if they hand color them carefully. They don't have to be particularly artistic, but they use a wide variety of colors. They are careful and make the things that they're doing attractive. They have said that their students then tend to be drawn to those materials and will use them even when there are pre-printed materials available as well. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the pre-printed materials. In fact, one of the reasons that I'm saying this is because I would choose this. If it were me, these beautiful kind of a stylized drawing material is what attracts me more. But that is not necessarily going to be the case with the children. And so I would encourage you to spend some time, particularly perhaps with subjects that you're noticing that children in your classroom are not being drawn to as much. If they don't seem to be that into the volcano work, then you may want to look into making some of these things by hand. The timeline of life is a huge project, but one of the things that I hear again and again from the educators who've made the time to make it is, oh, my children love the one that I made in my training. And so I would encourage you to at least consider that. Now, as you are considering the different ways that you might make materials, you've seen me talk about cutting up books. One of the things that I like to do is use things that I cut up to make materials. Now, this is a very old book. Some of the information in it is no longer accurate because of the archaeology that has happened since the book was published. This would be a really good candidate for cutting apart and making materials. One reason being that some of the illustrations are really engaging and attractive. Some of them actually have children in them. Some of them have activities that are happening and the sequence of activities that are happening. And so they're very interesting to the children. So if you have books that it's really not appropriate to put on your shelf because they're not accurate anymore, or you have a book that you're finished with but has some really wonderful diagrams in it, that's a great way to make some materials on your own. Now, I have just moved from an area very rich in archaeological resources, I guess. Utah has a lot of places where dinosaurs have been found, and it's very common to have news in the local paper there about anything that's happening with local finds in archaeology, as well as other discoveries in the field. And I've always made a point to clip those out so that I could be up to date. And I have noticed that when I do have something out on the shelf, on the zoology shelf at the time that we're studying the prehistoric animals or something, when I have a clipping from the paper and maybe I have a caption that, with the date and that this was just discovered, that is the kind of thing that tends to attract older children to the material. And the last piece that I'm going to talk about in terms of making your own materials is anything that you are involved with has the opportunity for kind of an excitement factor when you present it to the children. This is a booklet on Hungary that is from a swap that I did. So I corresponded with another Montessori educator who had relatives in Hungary and had some roots in Hungary. She didn't live there at the time of the swap, but she had a lot of materials from Hungary, and I had a lot of Native American materials from Navajo tribes and some other Native Americans that that it's easy to get artifacts from in the Utah area, and so we did a swap. So she sent me information and artifacts for my Europe box, and I had artifacts for her North America box, with the interesting factor that it was from the Navajo and the Ute tribes, not just general American Indian or Native American. And so when I present this booklet, my excitement, my fun at having connected with someone who was sharing that with me comes across. And I have noticed that the children are drawn to it. They're interested in it, at least in part because I'm interested, and maybe also because someone for whom Hungary is a special place chose the things that she thought were most special to share with me for the booklet. So your enthusiasm is never to be underestimated. Now, I'm going to close this segment with a little more boring activity around your materials, which is keeping them nice. And I mention this because this model of a volcano is one that I purchased back in the 80s from a manufacturer that I couldn't tell you what it was today to save my life, and it's not one that I think you would be likely to be able to buy anything from. But when the model came, it was a mess. It had cracks. You could see the white plaster that the model was made from. And so actually, not that long ago, about 9 years ago, when I finally got around to it, I repainted it and put a shiny coating on it so that it's beautiful. And when I present it to the children, I don't go into detail, but I mention that. And I say, these little pins that help hold the model together when it's sitting on the shelf could also scratch it. So please pay attention as you use it so it will stay beautiful. So I'm going to encourage you 3 different habits in regard to this little example. One is, if you have things in your classroom that are not as beautiful as you would like them to be, put that on your list of things to do. Beautify them when you can so that they will be more attractive and draw the children to them. Second, share with the children some of those things that you do that just kind of help them realize what it takes to create and maintain the beautiful environment. And then finally, share with them how they can keep that environment beautiful. I hate to say most, at least many of the students that we have these days have not been taught how to handle things carefully, how to handle books, dishes, anything else that maybe has a little bit more of a fragile nature or that fingerprints can make ugly quickly. So assume your students haven't been taught how to handle things properly and teach them those skills just as you would teach them to add or read or any other skills so that you can work together to have your environment be as beautiful and engaging as possible. Not that long ago, I was in the position of taking over the responsibility for being the lead educator in an upper elementary Montessori classroom in a public school, a charter public school. And it was a huge responsibility. I found that it challenged me on several different levels. I had a lot of Montessori background. I had taught older children within an elementary classroom that mostly included younger children, but that was my first time teaching children from age 9 to 12 and being responsible for the Montessori curriculum for children who would be the equivalent of 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in the United States. Not only was I responsible for teaching them the Montessori curriculum, but I was also responsible for the state standards for the school where I was teaching, because that's the nature of teaching Montessori in a public school. And I found myself completely overwhelmed. If it wasn't parent communication or a behavioral challenge in the classroom or not knowing how to keep track of the progress on all of those state standards for which I was responsible, making sure the children made progress, it was just the whole situation of that new routine. I have found that if you do everything for someone, it's not a good thing. They don't learn very well, but I've also found that if you expect someone to do more than they can possibly do in the hours that they have available, they are definitely not going to succeed nor serve the children in the best way. So I have created something that I am calling a Montessori co-op, a co-op for consulting that allows those schools that have educators starting out or who are very new to the Montessori classroom to have some of those responsibilities done for them and to have a way to check in, a way to have observations done by an experienced Montessori educator who can give them good feedback and help them learn how to find the solutions that they need. If you are looking for parent newsletters, lesson plans, correlation from the Montessori curriculum to the Common Core state standards of the United States, this is something that I can help you with. Our cooperative can allow you for a very reasonable amount of money to have some of these things done for your teachers. Allow them to be at their best. Allow them to learn from where they're starting. Meet them where they are. Let them have Montessori education be as joyful an experience as you are seeking to provide for the students in your school. If we can help you, we are happy to be that resource that lets your students and your teachers make the most of the coming school year.